Welcome. We are receiving Professor Nadine Gaab from Harvard Medical School, Harvard Graduate School of Education, and Boston Children's Hospital. Professor Nadine Gaab, welcome to our country.
Thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
We are honored indeed. So I would like you to summarize your research. What are your main research lines and the main research findings?
So my lab at Boston Children's Hospital primarily works on language-based learning disabilities with a strong focus on developmental dyslexia. The main motivation of our research is what we call the Dyslexia Paradox. So right now in the US, but also in other countries, we have the problem that we have a way to fail approach. So we have the children to fail over several years before they receive a diagnosis of developmental dyslexia. However, there has been really great research that has shown that if you intervene earlier in kindergarten or first grade, or even earlier than that, that you have much better effects, much larger effect sizes. So you have this paradox between the time when you receive a diagnosis and the window of the optimal window for intervention.
Yes.
And so our research primarily focuses on identifying children at risk before they even start learning to read. So we are working a lot with preschoolers, with infants, and doing longitudinal research and tracking their development over time to see how does their brain develop, how does their language develop, how does their pre-reading and reading skills develop over time.
So all that effort is to take advantage of the neuroplasticity.
Yeah, so we know that the younger the brain is, the more plastic it is. And there's a good example of learning a second language. So if you want to learn a second language, and let's say you move to Germany,
yes,
and you are 4, it's very likely that you will pick up the language without any accent, with correct grammar, in a relatively short period of time. However, if I move you as a 10-year-old, or I move you as a 15-year-old or an adult, it will be almost impossible. And that's due to the increased heightened plasticity in the brain the younger a child is. So it makes a lot more sense to identify children and intervene much, much earlier.
What would be the ideal age for intervention?
So that's part of the research. So I don't have the exact answer yet. We know from the previous work that the effect sizes in kindergarten, so that's the first year of schooling in the US, and first grade are much better than intervening in third and fourth grade. But there's very minimal research younger than that. So it doesn't mean that it may not be possible to identify and intervene even earlier. It could also be that this is different for different languages. It could be that for some languages you have an earlier window versus for other languages a little bit later. But I think it should happen prior to the onset of reading or with the onset of reading, and not many years later.
Perhaps 4 to 5 years of age,
yeah.
K1, K2.
Yes, I think that would be a good.
At the maximum, the first grade, but after the second grade, you think that the neuroplasticity would decrease too much?
Yeah, so it's not that the interventions won't work anymore. So I think that's really important to state. But I think the longer you wait, you will have reduced plasticity. Plasticity never ends. You still have plasticity when you're 90 or 100, but you will have a decrease in plasticity.
It's remarkably similar to cochlear implant.
Yeah, interesting.
You should not wait too much after 7 years of age. That would be not.
Probably due to the same reasons.
Yes.
Yeah. Also, there's a lot of psychological and clinical implications of having to fail for so many years. There's lower self-esteem, high increase of depression, you have high incidences of anxiety. These children are less likely to finish high school. They are more likely to show aggressive behavior in response of, to frustration. So they're more likely to maybe enter the juvenile justice system at one point. So there's a whole variety of comorbid consequences of waiting to failing and waiting for so many years. So I think this could all be prevented, which is an incredible cost-effective tool by identifying early, intervening early, and then tracking the child very carefully and see, is this back on track, or do we need some additional interventions after that?
So early intervention is the key. How do you identify children at risk of developing dyslexia?
Yeah, so I think there's been really great work all over the world that has looked at precursors of developmental dyslexia. So there's like really great research coming out of the UK, and the Netherlands, the US and Germany, and many other countries have looked into this. And so people have identified a set of precursors of reading outcome. So that includes phonological awareness, it includes rapid ornitized naming, it includes letter sound knowledge, it includes listening comprehension, vocabulary.
Expressive and receptive.
Exactly, yeah. So these are the best predictors of later reading outcomes. So ideally one would screen effectively and wide for these early markers, and then one would then give early intervention to the children at risk, almost like a preventive tool. So right now, I always like to use the analogy of a heart attack. So right now, what we do is we wait till the kids have a heart attack, and then we are trying very cost-intensive to fix this with lots of effort. But we should shift to identifying the kids with the high cholesterol and the bad habits, exactly, and intervene early, which is a lot more cost-effective, so that they never get to a heart attack.
Yes, or a stroke.
Whatever.
Yes.
Yes. So are all precursors behavioral? Are there other ways that we could identify those children at risk, let's say in a clinical setting, parents who have a history of dyslexia?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah, so we know that if you have an older sibling or a parent with developmental dyslexia, you have about a 50% chance to develop dyslexia yourself. So this is much higher than the autism spectrum. This is much higher than ADHD. So if you think about this, we often say if you have no other tools in your classroom, you have really limited resources, at least asking whether there's a familiar risk of dyslexia is, the number one question kindergarten teachers or preschool teachers should ask families. Yeah.
And the intervention can revert how much of that?
So there has been some really great work. There's a big meta-analysis about this, some really great work coming out of the Florida Reading Institute and other people show depending on how intensive the intervention is and what kind of intervention, you can think 50 to 90% of kids then develop typical reading abilities if you identify early and then intervene early. So if you put this in an economic cost-effective analysis, you can see that it's much more cost-effective to identify early, intervene early, than to wait later. And also, we know that around third grade, you're shifting from learning to read to reading to learn, right? So, so there's this big shift where you don't get any instruction anymore how to decode or how to read, but you have to read in order to understand your math problem, you have to read in order to understand your history, homework, in order to put an essay together, etc., etc. So if you can't read by then, you will exponentially drop in your academic performance, not just in the reading, but also in other subjects, which then leads to even more failure, because you may have liked math before, but now you can't even decipher the math problem, you get a bad grade, and then you don't like math anymore, and so it has this spiraling effect.
That's right.
That's
right. And what is the place of the neurobiological findings?
So it's been really nicely replicated that there are certain brain characteristics of dyslexia. So we see them primarily in the left hemisphere and primarily in the posterior, the back part of the left hemisphere. So there are, people have called it the triangle model of reading. So you have the visual word form area, which identifies letters and words, and then you have the more the Wernicke area, or the supramarginal gyrus, which does a lot of the mapping from the sounds of language onto the written counterparts, and then so phonological processing, the mapping, the grapheme, phoneme mapping. And then you have the inferior frontal region, which does a lot of the higher order semantics, integration, but also some phonological processing with fluency and things like that. And so people have shown that, especially in younger children, there's primarily deficits in the left hemisphere and these posterior regions. And so that has been replicated very nicely. I think it's better replicated than for other developmental disorders. So we know a lot more about the brains of kids with dyslexia than we know about the brains of kids with autism, for instance. It's much more homogeneous, much more replicated. And so what we've done a lot in my lab is to answer the question, how early do these brain characteristics of dyslexia appear? Are you born with this? Or is it something that develops over time during language development? Or is it something that just develops while you start failing? And what we do is we look at preschoolers as well as infants who have a strong genetic risk. So they have an older sibling or a parent, and then we follow them, and we know that 50% of them will develop dyslexia. And so we can track them over time and see when do we see these brain differences. And what we could show is that these brain differences predate the onset of reading. Okay, so that's very important because what we basically see is that these kids step into their first day of kindergarten with a less optimal brain to learn to read. And we still wait 2, 3, 4, 5 years until we give them a diagnosis and until we give them resources to get help. So that has tremendous implications for their mental health, for their academic success, for the whole family, because this kid will be embedded in a family system that has to deal with these problems, stress and failure and things like that. So we and others have shown this for gray matter, we have shown this for white matter, which are the highways that connect the different cortical areas. We've shown this for sulcal pattern, which is, where are the gyri and the sulci on the cortical surface. And so right now it looks like that it predates, we know that it predates reading onset. So some of the research we are conducting right now with the help of NSCHD and other funders is to look whether you are already born with this, whether this is something that may develop in utero in response to invariant function of the dyslexia susceptibility genes.
Yes.
So the idea is that these genes, the dyslexia susceptibility genes, show some variant function, which leads to atypical cortical development in utero with very subtle changes that cannot be seen on an MRI necessarily, but on a group basis. But ectopia, just like Albert Galaborder has shown, etc. So then, when you're born, this has no effect initially because you're not building the triangle yet. But then some of these kids already show early problems with language. We say about maybe 30%, right? And then while you develop the important components of the reading network, then this becomes problematic because you have this atypical brain development. And so if you intervene early and the brain is more plastic, you can make the brain, the goal is to then detour the traditional reading network and build an alternative network. And so we're also very interested in what kind of environmental variables can facilitate this. So home literacy, reading a lot of books at home, the quality of reading. There could be other factors that we are looking at right now. What are the protective factors and what are the environmental protective factors, especially.
Well, school quality, parent involvement, for instance.
But we have, some preliminary evidence from our lab also shows that there are some interesting protective mechanisms, such as the accuracy of your articulations. It has to be, a very good protective factor. So I think it's really important that these kids get early help from a speech and language pathologist, so that this can then be resolved before they even start school.
That is why dyslexic people cannot speech read.
Okay.
That's a consistent finding. I have obtained that finding also.
Okay.
Speech reading emerges only when both the deaf person or the hearing person acquires literacy.
Okay.
I have tested hundreds of children, hearing children, and they have been able to show speech reading skill only when they acquire a given level of reading proficiency, alphabetical reading proficiency. And the same happens with the deaf. Deaf people acquire literacy early when they have access to sign language. So sign language ends up benefiting literacy acquisition, which in turn benefits speech reading.
That's very interesting.
It's interesting that cochlear implantation is recommended as early as 6 months of age. I wonder how early can we go in terms of intervention?
That's a very good question. I don't think I have the answer yet. So let's assume we would have a way to identify children at risk that early, and we don't have that quite yet. And we don't know if we will ever have that, but we are working on it. Then the question is, what kind of intervention would that be? How could that look like? And I think that's something that people have to work out in the future. There's some great work by April Banasich at Rutgers, who has done some auditory training early on in infants, and see that it's very beneficial for language development later. But I think at this point we just don't know. I think we have to work on the sensitivity and specificity of the screening measures. And once we have a good way of screening these kids, and I think we're close, then we can then think like, what would we do with them? I think that's important.
Those are great news. We have mapped in Portuguese all the lalins with their relationships with sounds, with phonemes. And so we can ascertain precisely the degree of readability, speech readability of any given word. And I was thinking, what is your opinion about virtual reality? Could we structure in open environments with virtual reality so as to help children at risk of developing dyslexia to learn consistent relationships between speech articulation and speech sounds, perhaps.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that is very interesting. So what we're currently doing is we're working on an app. So it's a really nice game. So we do this in collaboration with some great game designers from MIT and other entities. And so the idea here is that you would give the child the tablet and you would play this game. So it's a game where you walk with a friend through a city and you meet all kinds of interesting animals. And they give you tasks. And so you're playing this game, and then at the end you would determine whether the child is at risk for dyslexia or not. So, but we think it's even more important to have a second component here. So you could screen the whole world. If you don't have evidence-based response to screening in place, it's useless, right?
Yes.
So what we are planning to do is to develop a series of videos that would then tell the teachers or the speech and language pathologist, the parent, or whoever works with the child, what they could do. Also curriculum programs that you can download, materials that you can download. So our goal is not just to screen every child, but also to deliver the appropriate tools for intervention with and give them access to where is the next neuropsychologist for more testing, where is the next intervention center, etc., etc. So we're working on this right now. So my dream would be, so it's different in different countries, but in the US, for instance, to have every child be screened at their 4 or 5 well visits. At the pediatrician's office, you would get the tablet and you do it in the waiting area, or you get the link sent home before you come. You could do it at summer camps, at daycares, at children's museums. You could do it at all kinds of places where children are to really screen them widely, to identify the children at risk, to make sure they get help early. And I think that would have tremendous impact on reading trajectories in these kids.
And that sets the stage for a very important question, public policy. What is the implications of your work for public policies in dyslexia?
Yeah. So we think that we're very close in translating the work we do into public policy, and that doesn't happen very often in the developmental disorder world quite yet. So we work closely with groups that help us with the legislation in Massachusetts, but we're also working closely with US-wide efforts, and I would be more than delighted to also work with international efforts on this. So our hope is that there would be mandatory screening, so that every child has to be screened. And there's actually some states in the US that already have that in place. New Hampshire, Texas, New Jersey, a couple more places. So mandatory screening in preschool or kindergarten, so that we can identify early, but then we need evidence-based responses to these screening in place. So I think this has to happen at the same time. And then I think that would make a really big impact on the lives of children at risk, but also kids who have spontaneous mutations, right? So it's not that just kids have that we should just address the kids who have an older sibling or parent, right? So we should just screen everyone.
Yes.
And I think it's also important that we include. So we see there's an umbrella of reading disabilities, and then dyslexia is under the umbrella of reading disabilities, right? But you don't want to just focus on the dyslexia. You want to get all kids that have problems with reading. So I think including things like vocabulary or listening comprehension that is very much related to socioeconomic status or the education of their parents is really important for inclusion in the screening.
In that beautiful, generous plan of yours, organizations such as the Brazilian Dyslexia Association will be instrumental for implementing your plan.
Yeah, so it would be really great if you could partner up with us and maybe help us to translate this app into Brazilian
Will.
Portuguese, and then have school district try this, get the norming, etc. But also contribute to the worldwide global effort in identifying precursors of reading disabilities, dyslexia in each language, so that we can help each child in their appropriate language. And especially bilingual children where they often fall through the cracks, etc.
That is our dream.
Yes.
That is what we live for. So that is why we are so glad and honored to have you.
No, it will be wonderful.
Well, thank you so very much, Professor Nadine.
Thank you for
Thank
having
you.
me.
It was a deep honor and a privilege for us. So now we are going to have our course. Thank you for
Thank
watching. Please come to know us, the Brazilian Dyslexia Association. We're always doing something remarkable. Till the next time, bye-bye.